art and its relationship to life. And it's worth reminding ourselves that the word artificial comes from the word art. Artificial means relating to art, so it seems appropriate to give this word some context. Now, art isn't something that likes to be defined. It's typically involved in playing a kind of game of escaping definition, of destroying old categories and building new ones. But without ruining the game, I'd like you to entertain the idea that art is simply our way of describing the world to each other. One way of describing the world to each other, just like talking. And when we make art, we look at our experience and find interesting patterns within it, and then we reproduce them. And it's impossible to talk about what art is without discussing language. And this is something that I'll get into a little bit later. But basically, art finds its purpose and its function in describing things that language cannot. And you might ask, well, what's outside of language? And it turns out there's quite a lot. In every successful work of art, the limitations of language are revealed. So if I wanted to describe this plant, I might say that it's green and leafy and kind of tall, but I couldn't begin to describe the particular shade of green, or its transparency, or the way light hits it, or the way wind moves through its leaves. And so our language has a resolution problem, a very obvious resolution problem. I couldn't describe how one leaf appears to repeat itself in a particular spiral, or how the entire plant seems to repeat itself around itself. Now, these things could be described in mathematics, but not very many people can see the beauty in an algorithm, while almost everybody can see the beauty in an image. Our language is not adept at conveying these systems underneath nature. I can only focus on one moving part at a time. And it's quite abstract. And so we divide up the world into nouns and verbs, into things that are static and things that are moving. But even though we know, really, that everything is in motion and all moving together. And so the first realization is that words are simply not enough. We cannot properly describe life using language alone. So art fills in these gaps in our understanding. It describes the patterns that our language cannot. And of course, it doesn't do so perfectly. It's limited, just the way words are. It's always a cartoon compared to the thing itself. But what art can do is draw our attention to things that we weren't aware of, which are true, and which couldn't be described otherwise. And beyond this, we come to find that art is very useful at describing things that don't make sense in language. And love is a great example here. Artists spend a lot of time and effort on this subject, and scientists don't. Everything's intelligence. But artists love this subject. Why? Because it's very mysterious to us. Love contradicts logic in a number of ways, but consider the aspect of mutual possession. How can I own you if you own me? It's a hierarchical problem. How can I become more free by being more trapped? These things don't make sense. And so art embraces this mystery. It doesn't explain it, it describes it. And the feeling it creates is wonder. And so how does meaning become created by art? Well, imagine this is you, a conscious aperture on the world, an indivisible unit of experience. And you navigate your world and survive based on what you learn. And by being alive, you test the world and develop an individuality based on billions and billions of positive and negative experiences. And so your individuality, who you are, is, in a sense, billions of likes and dislikes, of biases that help you survive. And so from this process, internally, you develop a model of the world. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. And then you come across something new, something weird, something artificial, and some people are calling it art. And you try to interpret it. You interact with it mentally. And if you interpret it as true, you like it. And if you dislike it, you're going to interpret it as false. In other words, if the model of the world presented in art aligns with yours, it's true. And there are, of course, other people with their own models of the world. And they will like or dislike it depending on their particular individuality. And they will all disagree on whether or not it really is art. Meaning emerges in this process of interaction, of our identification with patterns. And so we're constantly checking for symmetry between our model of the world and the model of the world presented in art. When these patterns overlap, it helps us. It makes us better at navigating the world. Art is this space where our most private and confusing thoughts can be articulated. And when they are, we become more confident and functional in our daily lives. Basically, art can allow us to feel less alone in the universe. Now, life and other people often give us the opposite message. We like to emphasize our differences. I'm me and you're you. And however unconsciously, we can make each other feel more alone. And so art is this way of teaching each other about the things that we can't talk about. It's the most non-invasive way we have of touching each other's brains. Now, of course, the meaning that emerges is different for everybody, and its particular functionality can only be measured on an individual basis. And so, when we create something, we hope that the patterns that we describe are familiar to other people. They might be weird for us, but we hope that they're recognizable to others, and that other people can benefit from them. Now, science is also looking at life and finding interesting patterns in it. But the methods are quite different. So science has to be true for everybody, and so it has to live inside of language. And from a certain perspective, science is a kind of a hunt for difference, and scientists have to be very careful about making comparisons between different phenomena. Now, in contrast, art looks at the totality of experience and can make all kinds of comparisons within it, and they can be very abstract. Colors can compare to sounds, can compare to textures, and so on. These can be very abstract, but they can be just as true to the individual. And so back to language. Why am I representing language with this weird shape? Well, imagine this is a series of interconnected nouns and verbs, and at the top we have our basic assumptions, and as we work our way down, we arrive at more complex solutions. And so more layers become added as our understanding grows, more words and more categories are introduced. And so as we work our way down, complexity increases. So consider that this downward complexity is created by the question what? What creates detail? If you keep asking what, you're going to get more and more detail. And as we work our way upstream, we move away from the question what and towards the question why. And with why, we look towards our basic assumptions, and complexity decreases. And so this structure is reinforced by both what and why. Now, children love to ask this question over and over again and drive their parents crazy. But at a certain point, they stop because there are no meaningful conclusions. If you keep asking why, you end up with a conclusion like it is because it is. Why are you here? Because I bought a ticket. Why did you buy a ticket? Because I was curious. Why were you curious? Because my mother was curious. Why was your mother curious? Because her mother was curious. Why was her mother curious? Because her mother was curious. And so, etc., etc. And so you end up with this kind of circular pattern. And in logic and in language, we call this pattern a tautology. And we avoid saying this in speech. We avoid saying the same thing twice. And we avoid saying the same thing twice because it's not useful. But these tautologies are not meaningless. They're actually very interesting because they serve as the basis for our more complex thoughts. So, to make an analogy to science, the tautologies in science are a little bit like the constants in physics, things like the speed of light. And these are true because they're true. And without them, we can't have the many discoveries on which they depend. And there's nothing past them. Or is there? So if we look past the patterns which make up our basic assumptions, we enter the unusual space of contradictions which are true. Now, like the example of mutual possession in love that I mentioned earlier. So why leads us into patterns and contradictions and away from logic and variation? This question, why, approaches the origin point of everything. It leads directly to existence. And it can be scary, because it doesn't make sense. Consider that art is generally motivated by this question, why, and science is generally motivated by this question, what. Now, both are trying to describe the world, but using these different modes of thought represented by these different questions. When an artist, or when an artwork, tries to explain itself with reasons, with what, it fails. All of its mystery and wonder evaporates. You don't want to know why a musician chose a certain chord, or or even what chord they chose. And the inverse is also true. So if a scientist or if science tries to explain why, it also fails. It ends up in contradiction and nonsense. And so these questions are like opposing forces. And as well as characterizing the nature of art and science, they also exist in each of our heads. And so in each of our minds, these questions exist in a kind of mutual relationship. It's of course possible for an artist to think scientifically as it is for a scientist to think artistically. And you could argue that our best scientists are secretly artists and vice versa. The tension between these questions produces not only our understanding of the world, but is also responsible for everything around us. Why creates wonder? And what creates discovery? And without wonder, we would not pursue what, and without discovery, we could not pursue why. So these questions need each other, and they push each other, and they reinforce our model of the world. And if we're not careful, we can get lost in either of these questions. It's possible to keep questioning why too much, and to keep questioning what too much. We need to oscillate between them. This model of the world that we have is always changing throughout our lives. We need to constantly update our image of how life works. And we do this from experience, but also from new ideas, courtesy of new art and new science. It's very rare for these fields to come together in a meaningful way. But it's happening here today in Mid-ICANN and for the rest of the week. And I'm very grateful to be part of it. Thank you.